Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for a TFANA talk on the Oresteia. My name is Tatiana Casas-Quinones, and I'm I'm the manager of humanities and studio programs at TFANA. And today, I just want to, welcome you to this TFANA talk, which is part of the Artists and Community series, exploring vital connections between the theater and our world. The Oresteia was produced under the auspices of TFANA's Merle Debuskey studio program. And Merle Debuskey was a beloved member of our board and a great press agent who had an extraordinary influence on New York theater. The studio is directed by Nydia Medina, and the studio supports process development and experimentation for theater artists throughout residencies, workshops, and ongoing professional development. Today's conversation will last about an hour, and we're going to have a conversation between the panelists, and then we're going to have times for questions at the end. Please make sure that if you have any questions, to put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. When you click that, you just type that in at any point during the talk, and then at the very end, we will select a few questions. TFANA staff will be monitoring the feed. And if your question is selected, we will reply in the chat box to give you some instructions about how you can join with your audio. Now let me introduce our panelists for today. McLaughlin is a translator and adapter of the Oresteia. Her plays have been produced off-Broadway, regionally, and internationally. She is a recipient of the Writers' Award from the Lilla Wallace Reader's Digest Fund, as well as other honors, including the Susan Smith Blackburn Prize, the Helen Merle Award for Playwriting, and grants from the NEA. Welcome, Ellen. Andrew Watkins is the director of the Oresteia. His work includes adaptations of literary classics, new plays, and devised performances. He has worked as an associate and assistant director for both nationally and internationally, including Broadway and here at TFANA. He's the recipient of the Puffin West Foundation grant for artistic creation related to social issues. Welcome, Andrew. Bianca Vivion Brooks is a writer, artist, and producer based in Harlem, New York. At 14, she began as a commentator on NPR's All Things Considered, and at 18 went on to become the youngest opinion writer in the New York Times. Now at 24, she's producing a talk show, Generational Anxiety, for PBS's All Arts channel. Welcome, Bianca. Andrew Lichtenberg will be moderating today's talk. He's a literary manager and resident dramaturg at Shakespeare Theater Company in Washington, D.C., where he was the dramaturg on the world premiere of this translation of the Oresteia. Drew, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And I hand this over to you, Drew.
Thank you, Tatiana, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Bianca, to Ellen, to Andrew for joining me for this conversation today. I'm really excited as somebody who worked on a version of this play. It was a wonderful surprise to know that TFANA was doing it, to see many familiar faces and some new faces reading Ellen's amazing words. And yeah, just to have another chance to encounter this work and the complex of ideas that are embodied within it. I'm curious, maybe if we could start with Ellen and Andrew talking about the process for how this iteration of the Oresteia developed. It premiered, as Tatiana was saying, at STC in Washington, DC in 2019. And now it's coming to us in this new medium of Zoom. So I'm curious how the idea maybe was generated, what some of your original conversations were, and how did the piece evolve in translating it to Zoom, to a kind of more interactive context. Ellen, maybe do you want to start with that question?
I'm going to throw it to Andrew because it really is his his project in the sense that he pitched it and began it. So I'll let you handle this, Andrew.
Yeah, I don't know how to answer that question either, because I also feel like very just constricted by Zoom, and we've done what we could. But there was a question posed by one of the audience members at the talk yesterday about the actors being, they feel like they're communicating with each other in a way that's not always present in a lot of Zoom performances. And I was thinking about that last night, of how much time people have spent on this medium. Because I think I said something like, well, these actors have done it live before, were benefited by that, and that was really helpful. But I've also been thinking a lot, last night I was thinking a lot about how much time we spent on here and how much we've actually learned to listen and communicate over this platform over this year. And the thing that hasn't really been taken away from us is we can actually sit here and listen to somebody, which is actually kind of a gift. So I think we've somehow adapted to actually listen over the computer in a way we haven't had to before. So that seems like it comes through. And then the other thing was I really was thinking about how to make it as simple as possible and really do everything you can to keep it really focused on the text and really make it easy to listen to the words. And it takes a lot of effort to make something simple over Zoom, as it turns out, because the standard aesthetic is very chaotic. The standard aesthetic is everyone in a different place with the bookshelf behind them, with their own decorations, wearing whatever they're wearing that day. And it's a very sort of chaotic thing. And so trying to take a lot of that away was, I think, really important, of getting just sort of dark squares and keeping them in very simple clothing and making it as simple as possible is important as well. But other than that, I feel like you can't really translate theater over Zoom. It's something different, and we've done the best we could.
Yeah, well, I've seen a couple productions of theater via Zoom over the past however many months this has been, the past dark age that we've all been living through. And your direction of this, Andrew, struck me as being somewhat unique, I would say. This very deliberate choice to have darkened kind of a uniformity of a visual language, to take away all the Easter eggs that often pop up on people's bookshelves, which I will plead guilty of, really seemed to accentuate so much of Ellen's writing and the language, the beauty, the poetry of the language in this version of the Oresteia. And I was really grateful for you giving us that. There are obviously visual things, choreographic things you can't do on Zoom. So this idea of less is more seemed to somehow kind of amplify the text or bring out the kind of tone poem buried within this epic trilogy in a way. Not a question.
Yeah, well, also as someone who's done a lot of plays with no money, one of the things that I've learned, when you have one design choice you can make, the best one you can make is to change the floor and bring the audience closer, because it takes you out of the theater space and then you get closer. And if you can't do anything else, that's it. Just paint the floor. And this was sort of a version of painting the floor. So.
Painting the floor, I love that. Also, I should point out, the music by Kamala Sankaram is the same music, I believe, that was used for the original production in DC. And again, it had a totally different valence in this medium than it did in the theater. It kind of made everything feel like we were floating in this ambient kind of sack of emotion. So again, this kind of amplification. Bianca, I'm really curious to hear how the piece resonated for you in this particular political moment. You were saying before we went on that you read some of the classics when you were at Columbia as an undergrad, and just a little bit of context for this version of the Oresteia. It was commissioned all the way back, I think, in 2015, before the election of 2016. It premiered in DC in 2019 during the kind of, not the apogee of the nadir of the Trump era, but certainly smack dab in the middle. And now it's being produced in 2021 in yet another different political climate. So it's a piece that has been born out of these turbulent last 5 or 6 years. I'm wondering if that resonated with you, or if other aspects of it.
There's a few things that resonated with me, Drew. One was to comment on Ellen and Andrew's point. The closeness and the richness of language really came out while I was listening to this version, and it kind of reminded me of the sort of old wartime radio stories, when you're like crowded around the radio and you're like listening to the different voices come through and tell the story. And that was something I'd never experienced firsthand, obviously, because of the advent of technology. But when I used to read books and watch movies and listen to even my grandparents tell stories about the importance and critical mass of radio, that was kind of what came through with this. And it was honestly, to be completely honest, it was because at some certain points I'd go get food, or I'd be, doing something else, but I'd be listening to this play, and like the voices, the richness of the actors was coming through, and the language was felt in a way that might have been lost on stage because you're so caught up in visual mechanisms when it comes to stage plays and staging, and you want to see the costumes and the lighting and everything else. And so I think, honestly, as just a challenge against modernity, the Zoom thing that feels like punishment a lot of times had me in a completely different experience of theater that I feel like is almost a relic that I would have never been able to experience otherwise, which was really the power of voice acting and the sort of like inflection and tone that comes through that. As far as your politics question, I think that it's not even just relevant before Trump, relevant during the Obama era, relevant for literally the last 100 years, is trying to think about what we as an American society think about carceral systems, what we think about punishment, what we think about crime. And I think that there's so many different points in this version where you start to ask, like, what is the truth and who holds it? Or, you know, there's the end where we're trying to punish the son for something that was predates his life. And that's a lot of how American carceral systems work, where people get caught up in systems that have existed and predated their lives, and their parents were involved in it, and their parents' parents. And there's this question when you ask, like, when does it end? Do you have to exterminate an entire family to end these cycles of punishment? When I was in college, I actually majored at Columbia in international human rights, and I wrote my thesis on truth and reconciliation committees in Rwanda, you know, post-genocide. And I know that Ellen, having read a Times review, some of your, and I would love for you to talk about this, some of your inspiration for the changes from the original were from the Truth and Reconciliation Committees in South Africa. And I've actually been to the Peace and Reconciliation Committee in Liberia post their civil war. So kind of asking questions of what is truth, and when do cycles of violence end, and what is our responsibility as a society to, when we so easily turn people into criminals and to put, or, you know, mental health, whatever we do to create this sort of us and them feature to bring them back in. And I think that this play at so many different intervals ask about whose responsibility is it? And it's sort of like by the end, the chorus and everybody in the play has blood on their hands, and you don't really expect it. And then you end with this washing of hands that is purposefully read as casual, because it just becomes the grunt work of everybody to sort of clean society of the bloodshed that seems never ending. And I think in America, that's particularly potent because of our police issues and military industrial complex. And so those questions were brought to the forefront during the Trump era, but they're questions that are as prevalent now, that are happening on our border, that are happening in our communities real time. So just deal with any of that.
Yeah, it's certainly many points of entry for you, Ellen, but I will just add, as somebody who was there, I have a vivid memory of after the election of Trump, Ellen, you know, coming to me and Michael Condon saying, I don't know how to end this play. It seemed to personalize and make urgent all of these questions about truth, about justice, because the Oresteia as a story is about the origin of modern justice, right? The original Eumenides by Aeschylus ends with the first trial, and basically the suppression of Clytemnestra and the Furies, the matriarchal argument in favor of the patriarchal line, right? So if you follow Aeschylus, if you're faithful to the Aeschylus, arguably you're doing a disservice to the conversation that we need to be having now about this play. So yeah, I'm interested, Ellen, in revisiting some of those memories, and also, yeah, how you feel like this piece continues to resonate.
Yeah, I mean, I'd gotten through a rough draft of the first two acts and was just on the verge of writing the third act when the election happened in 2016. And so I went into a complete tailspin, which Drew knows all about, because I wrote and said, I don't know how to do this now. I mean, because I have seen the subjugation of the female to a fairly well, and I don't want any part of Aeschylus's version of the end of the play, and which ends with a kind of triumphalist sort of, now we understand what human justice looks like, and we're moving on into a just society, and we've figured out how to make human justice work. and democracy. But part of the, I mean, and it is the triumph of the patriarchy. There's no question about that. There is this sense of the suppression of the primordial female, which is so scary and has been up to such mischief. But there is also, in order to make that happen, Athena rightly understands that you have to bargain with that aspect of the human and say, we will exalt you, Furies, these terrifying figures, and we will worship you. Wouldn't you rather be worshipped than simply feared? We will also fear you because you are demigoddesses, but we will elevate you, and we will actually make the temple in which we worship you the foundation stones of the pantheon, and so of the Parthenon. And so there is this kind of like, and the ending is this triumphalist procession where they endow the Furies with red robes, and they're all gonna go up to the Acropolis. And it's a very complicated thing. But I also thought that kind of subtlety is completely lost on me at the moment. I'm so, as a feminist, I'm so deeply upset, and I have to find another way in, and another way towards some vision of something like justice, human justice. And I'm also profoundly concerned about what do we do with figures who have committed acts of extraordinary and inexplicable, to some extent, violence. What do we do about the Orestes among us? What do we do about those instincts that are part of the human? And I think that the way that it ends, the play ends, the question is still, okay, so he is guilty. I mean, he knows he's guilty. Everybody acknowledges. They all saw him do it. But what do? You know, well, there is this one thing that we can do, and what it amounts to, I don't know, but we can clean the blood off his hands, him and his sister's hands. And that is something, but what that means ultimately, I think I leave very open, and I think it's up to interpretation. Andrew, you were going to say something?
No, I'm just listening, and I agree with all of that. I mean, and I do think it's worth saying that the genesis of this production did happen post the killing of George Floyd, and I was in Minneapolis when that happened, and so I really appreciate what Bianca said, is that the themes of this play predate Trump. This goes back to Obama, to Clinton. It's going to continue in the Biden administration, and when we look at the plays, you know, it's when you say like the Oresteia is a play about the emergence of a justice system, you know, like the Eumenides are about that. It's not what Agamemnon's about, and it's not what the libation bearers are about. And what's really remarkable about this adaptation is that we start with the Agamemnon. You know, we see the cycles of violence happen before we get to a place where we need to go, okay, what happens next? And I think that's what's so powerful about and so ambitious about this adaptation, is you get all of it. But the audience has to see a lot of violence before we get to the end. And that feels really important in this, is we have to really reckon with the worst of us. We don't get to skip to the ending.
Yeah, it's a long road, and it's a very bloody road. And I mean, the reason that Truth and Reconciliation, the whole concept of, which I have found so moving just theoretically, unlike you, Bianca, I've never been to Africa, and so I don't know, I have not witnessed such a mode of dealing with the aftermath of extraordinary violence. I haven't seen it firsthand, but in concept, it's a very moving idea to me. And partly, I think the reason that I respond to the idea that what truth is, what the search for justice has to entail, is that everybody has a chance to speak their own truth, and that everybody will be listened to, however long it takes. And a friend of mine who actually did witness some of the South African version of this said there was one village where one woman spoke for a week, and everybody sat in the public square and listened for a week as she spoke. And it was, and you know, it takes as long as it takes, which can be a very long time. And I feel that, I mean, I've always felt that the fundamental principles of the Truth and Reconciliation approach are exactly the same as the fundamental principles of the theater. What we try to do, we gather people into a public space, and the truth is spoken in a public space to the public, to the common. And there is an attempt to not only speak the truth, but an attempt to listen to it. So I think, you know, that the fact that you brought up the audio quality of Zoom, I think is important. I mean, I think that there is a way in which audio comes in a kind of stealthier way than the visual, which is overwhelming and immediate, and it's our most overwhelming sense, the visual. But that means that the audio has this, it's apparently the last sense that goes, you know, in the movement towards death. There is this way in which it's, you know, the pouring of truth into the ear, the idea of the devil in my ear, and the idea of, you know, that truth makes its way through sound and through the audio.
I think that one of the things, and I think about Truth and Reconciliation committees, you know, is that they're primarily concerned with the preservation of a nation. Because after war, that's what comes into question the most, is that if a nation's going to continue, if it's going to break into factions, if a people can coexist together. And I think that one of the things that America's at this critical moment where people are asking, you know, everybody is concerned, I think right now, especially with telling the truth and telling their truth. And every single day you get a personal essay, even for myself, you know, being a personal essay writer, someone's like, I'm going to tell my truth. You know, from the perspective of my identity and my family history, or with Me Too, like these experiences of sexual trauma. But you get in the Oresteia this question of when you go, how does a victim become something more through the act of truth telling? And when they tell the truth, I think that conversion is into a witness. And that's what the Truth and Reconciliation committees were supposed to do, was that we're not saying that we're going to send these people to jail. A lot of them in Chile, a lot of the outrage in a lot of the places that this has been done, in Liberia and Chile, was that people didn't go to jail, they didn't pay for their crimes. South Africa was very different in that way, but a lot of people, it was that you exchanged your testimony for complete impunity, which was a very question, that model, you know, it has its controversy on its own, but it was about everybody being a victim of war in some way. Even the people who perpetuate war were being considered victims. And so if we could come up with this truth and really tell what has actually happened, could we find a way to coexist? And that coexistence becomes predominant, and it becomes the things that people are most concerned with for the preservation of society. And I think for America now, there's still a question that's being asked amongst races and political parties is, can we find a way to coexist? After the truth is told, after people have witnessed, I mean, I think the George Floyd point, to your point, Andrew, is extremely pertinent, because it was everybody turning into a witness of this, you know, of this crime that was happening before everybody, and everybody becoming somewhat responsible for how they were going to react to that, if they were going to deny it, if they were going to say, no, this is not the America that we live in. And I think now the question of this Biden era and just the post-pandemic after seeing so much death like happen across the world, is can we find a way to coexist together? And I think, and not in a cliche way or sort of kind of like, hippie peace way of overlooking things or coming up with a truth that benefits some and not others. But can we face that ugly truth and live together? And I think that it's so beautiful that these theaters are reopening and we're seeing these venues of art reopen, and they're becoming more critically important than they even were before the pandemic, because we see that art and the venue of the theater provides us a real place to tell those truths in interesting and entertaining ways. And a lot of, I'm sure, as you know, Ellen, the Truth and Reconciliation Committees in South Africa, there were plays, like whole theater troupes that would go from town to town and actually reenact some of the atrocities, but at the end put resolutions. There was this whole creative artistic aspect, because South Africa is such, a brilliant, vivid, artistic country, and dance and music and theater are not separate at all from a lot of what goes on in just daily society there. And so that became a part of this reconciliation process. And I think that the chorus coming in and acting as the jury in this trial, it was sort of reflective of the way that everybody becomes both complicit and responsible in those processes of reconciliation. And we see that in the play, and we're seeing that real time. And so it'll be you and I and Andrew and all of our responsibility in that way to start to think, like, what does coexistence look like? Sorry, it's the sounds of Harlem in the background.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant observation, Bianca. The dramaturgical innovation, I think, that Ellen's adaptation introduces, which is it's implicit in the original Aeschylus, but it's made even more intimate, I think, Ellen, in your version, where you have the shifting of the point of view from Clytemnestra with these amazing dream monologues and flashbacks. We really feel in a quasi-expressionistic way as if we're seeing reality through her eyes. And then to Electra and Orestes in Act 2, and finally this kind of floodplain dramaturgy of all of these people in the chorus who have been present throughout, but all of a sudden are introduced as subjectivities, as consciousnesses, as witnesses, bearing witness and testifying to their own experience. It's a really, I think, unusual and effective thing that is being done in this play, which is not usually, it's not a classic kind of protagonist structure where you follow one character through the play. It keeps on shifting and goes from one character to two to many characters that you're holding in your mind's eye. There's another, I would say, a paradigmatic innovation in this piece, which is the race conscious or color conscious and gender conscious approach to the classics, which I would credit this piece as exemplifying a kind of new way of approaching the classics, or one that's in line with many new conversations that are being had around the classics. I was certainly struck by how effective many of the casting choices were, both in the original production and also in this new iteration of having Orestes and Electra as, at least I interpreted them as, biracial children of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, and how that functions in an intrinsic way to the meaning of the story that is being told. So I'm interested, before we open up to questions, because obviously we could talk for hours, we've already been talking for, I think, 30 minutes, but I'm interested in hearing thoughts on how this piece can function as a new paradigm of a color conscious or gender conscious approach to the classics.
Well, one thing that comes up every time that you do an adaptation of a Greek play is, how does the chorus function? And the chorus functioned in ancient Greek theater as literally citizens of the cities where the plays were being produced. And they were citizens who volunteered their time and I don't think they were paid, were they, Drew?
I believe they were paid by the Corregos, who was the chorus.
Right. Yeah. But in any case, it was considered something of a cultural, it was like paying your dues culturally as a citizen. And you learned the dances and you learned the songs and you performed. But I think that idea of the chorus generally being representatives of the community who were going to be not only presenting the play but also receiving the play is just sort of baked into the form. And I feel that if you don't have a chorus that looks like America playing the chorus in these Greek plays, you are doing a total disservice to them. I mean, I think that it doesn't make any sense to do all white versions of any of these plays, because these are not, they're not intended to work that way. They're intended to be plays that represent the people who receive the plays. And I'm always interested to see how the sort of constellation, racially, ethnically, in terms of age, in terms of diversity of all kinds, how that works out in any version of a Greek play, because there are lots of different combinations and they don't all work. I mean, but it was the first time that I've seen that where all of the children of the house are people of color and I thought it was really helpful, really interesting, but it can work different ways. But
Yeah, I should say in the original Washington, D.C. production, we did have a white actor, a very gifted actor playing Orestes. And it did have a different valence. It did not allow race to be present in the same way, to me, in those final confrontations and arguments in the play.
yeah, and I think given the times that we're living through, it was important for all of us. I mean, it was Andrew's, you felt from the beginning that Orestes really had to be a man of color, given what we're dealing with. You don't want everybody standing around at the end thinking, what do we do about this victim white guy who's the perpetrator of the violence and also the victim of the violence, you know?
Yeah, Andrew, I'm curious if you want to talk about some of those discussions that were had, or how you feel.
I mean, Ellen sort of summed it up. Like, there's no reason to do an all white Oresteia. Like, this is I mean, if I walk outside, you know, it's, you know, it is a very diverse neighborhood I live in, and and it doesn't make sense to do this play that's not representative of that neighborhood. And there is a danger, and I think there was a danger in saying, let's take a white Orestes and sort of in some ways implicitly ask for the forgiveness of white sins. That's not what we're doing here. We're asking for what do we do? What do we do with someone who's committed something horrible, but that's not the tone this piece needs to have right now. I think what's a more interesting question for me is, how do you then start to break up the chorus, and who starts to have different opinions about what justice is, and who's capable of forgiving and who's incapable of forgiving. And you know, to have Cassandra and Iphigenia come back in the chorus and have two people who've been brutally murdered have very different opinions on what it means to forgive this person and what's the nature of justice. That became a really important part of the play for me. And we had a lot of conversation about one chorus member who we ended up casting a white woman for, and she's the one who's not unable to forgive. It's really, really hard for her. And so that was important as well. So I think it's looking at the entire community and where do people fall on this, and what are the hangups they have on forgiveness and justice, and what does justice mean to them, and have a conversation about what that means for people of different identities, and what are the underlying ideas for them given their identity, and having those conversations, letting them speak those as well was important.
I think that one of the interesting things about the casting of Cassandra that I noticed is that she being so unrelenting and so unwilling to forgive at the end and being like, this is somebody that has to die. I found it fascinating because thinking about her character, somebody who is a prophetess, but is wholly unbelieved and like goes through her life seeing horrible things and having visions of horrible things having happened, and then is just not believed by anybody. And now she's put as a chorus member into a position of power over somebody else's fate, somebody who had been previously disempowered. I found it really fascinating that she'd be so unrelenting, but then you think about people who, like I said, this going from everybody being a victim to then having to be a witness, and then the power of being a witness of all of the baggage that has come from being a victim, and then deciding somebody else's fate, but not really thinking about the preservation of the whole. Because at one point somebody just asked, like, is this, if you end his life, it will be the end of this entire family. Like he's the last one. I think there's a line that says there's nobody to hand the killing knife to. And I remember that was like one of my favorite
No one left
lines.
to hand the family knife to. Yeah.
Yes, nobody to hand the family knife to. And it is about like perpetuating these cycles of violence and, you know, the desire for carceral punishment. And even I think about it now, just because I'm subscribed to Death Penalty Action Now, like the newsletter, and it's all about like the death penalty and, you know, people who are trying to end the death penalty. When you really think about like who desires people to pay for things and why, and hearing these, you know, it gets to the point where there's like this critical mania where people in the chorus are just shouting over one another, like, he has to die, like, no, it's time to end the madness. And it reflects so much of our cultural conversations, I feel, that are in popular media, of like just the constant shouting of one another that kind of ends in just this, well, yeah, I mean, it's a question of how it always ends. As Ellen said earlier, it's a question, but I feel like it was almost comical to witness like that sort of mania happening in the chorus, and that inability to reconcile and see it despite race and class and gender throughout time at so many different intervals, like that inability to reconcile with one another over who pays for crime, and then seeing it racialized and seeing it with gender overlaid, and people's trauma coming to the forefront of being like, we have to punish this person, because that's kind of what happens when you disempower people and then give them power to end somebody else's life or keep you know, keep somebody alive. Like that is actually how it plays out, as we see in the Stanford prison experiment and these other, you know, critical points in modern society. It was extremely reflective, I felt, of reality, though a bit disheartening.
I just want to briefly remind anyone who's viewing, if you do want to ask a question of our brilliant panelists, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of their screens. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay. I certainly have many, many more questions that I'm very curious to hear the answers to. It really is, I think of something you said, Bianca, a question of how can we live with one another, right? Knowing what each of us is capable of. And just to circle back to our conversation about how theater in a traumatized society can function as a very important ritual. Of course, there's theater post-World War II in Germany. And I think it was Adorno who coined the term of the reckoning with the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung. But it actually happened in theater before it went into Adorno. It was the investigation by Peter Weiss, which was about the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. And the term for that was Bekenntnistheater, or confessional theater, the theater of confession, of bearing witness, of acknowledging the testimony of other people's truth. And it does feel like something about the way we all collectively experienced the murder of George Floyd in the middle of the pandemic, and then the way it was amplified through this medium that we're using right now in this incredibly intimate, incredibly visceral way, forced a reckoning of this kind to happen. Although, of course, it's the original sin of America. It's something that has been baked into this country since before this country was even established. And that's why, to me, it was, in a quiet way, a kind of revelatory way of re-experiencing this work. because I think you said earlier, Bianca, it's not something that is all of a sudden relevant or resonant. It's something that continues to resonate throughout and over time. And yet the particular way that we experience that resonance changes. And I think maybe that's what I'm trying to triangulate or get at, is that it feels in some ways like this work, even though I don't think, Ellen, you changed much, if any, of the words or the language for this 2021 version. It feels like history itself has made this Oresteia different in the way that we're experiencing it now than the way we might have experienced it in 2019 before the pandemic started.
Yeah, and I absolutely. I mean, the one thing that has changed, which is part of, I think, maybe it could be a problem, is that because Theatre for a New Audience wanted to do a smaller version of the play with fewer cast members, I had the Cassandra and the Iphigenia move into the chorus as actors, but they aren't actually Cassandra and Iphigenia. They are now, in the second half of the play, they become chorus members with different personalities, different needs, they're different characters. But I think on Zoom, it's almost impossible to create that distinction, so that, because I don't think it's helpful to think of in terms of Cassandra suddenly advocating for Orestes. I mean, I think that's a little problematic, but it took seeing it to realize, oh, maybe that doesn't work. Because when we did it in DC, we had 8 chorus members. And so the chorus members, the figures who were played by Iphigenia and Cassandra, those actors exist in the first act as well. But yeah, and I think that this play has a very different resonance now, partly because we've all gone through the pandemic year, where we've been dealing with this sort of being on the threshold of death as a common experience. I mean, this is not, it's different from the other pandemic that I've gone through in my lifetime, which is the AIDS epidemic, which was really the people who were suffering from that. It wasn't the sense of the entire globe was suffering from this thing, but this time we were all feeling the dread that these characters talk about over and over and over again. Why can't I, shake this sense of dread? I think we all know what that felt like, no matter who you were in this country or any country this last year and some, we've understood that. So, and I think that, the brutalization of the Trump era of American politics, the degradation of the American political speech and civic, conversation, the way that our ability to have any kind of back and forth respectful dialogue between sides in this country has just gone completely by the wayside. I certainly feel it. I think that just makes the final play yet that much more poignant, yet that much more acute, and so much more sort of urgent. We do have to figure this out, as you say, Bianca. If we can't figure out, fundamental coexistence in a meaningful way, not just being able to literally live in the same place, we are screwed as a country. And I think we're all sort of because we're screwed as a democracy. I mean, it's a very, very difficult business, not only to speak the truth, but to actually listen, to people who are so difficult to listen to.
Right, and if the original play written over 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, if it ends with the establishment of democracy, here we are now, kind of still asking these same questions about what the value of our democracy is, how representative our democracy is of everyone's experience, how justice can function in a democracy in a way that makes two mutually antagonistic sides both feel equally served and done justice to. So maybe that's, I mean, maybe this is a good final question to ask our panel, is how does this play, how does this play reflect on the state of our democracy? What can we learn about the nature of the future of our democracy from such a cautionary tale as this one? Maybe that's just a really heavy question to end on. I'm looking at Andrew and Bianca's faces. Is it only as good?
Andrew.
Sure. Yeah, I mean,
As good as our trust in each other? Is that maybe the kind of moral that we're reaching towards at the end of this play, this very fragile thing, which is the recognition of our own common humanity in each other?
I would just say that there's the sense of understanding our complicity in what is, I mean, it's like, it's what Electra says, you know, we all share in the fate of this house, its glory and its guilt. You know, we are all equally a part of this. And this endeavor has to be shared. We have to understand that, you know, you can't section yourself off in some room. And I think that's a very difficult reckoning for, particularly for those of us who have experienced all the privileges of our race and class and education and, you know, all it's acknowledging that in a real way is the first step, I think.
I think that I'm actually interested in a question in this play that we haven't talked about that might shock people, but it's not gendered or classed or racialized. It's asking a fundamental question that I feel like is becoming extremely pertinent in the 21st century, especially, which is, without God, how do we control how man treats his brother? This is something that's only come up really in the last 20 years, because even in the 20th century, America was not secular. Like, this was not a secular country in any consideration. In the 90s, you had the Pentecost and the Baptists. I was raised Baptist, later converted to Islam. And this question, I've written about it for an essay in the Times about progressivism and religion, about where our principles derive from. Because it can't, if we must live together, then it can't be self-interest. It cannot be what I'm fighting for, what I come to the forefront for, my story or my identity or whatever, because there's no way to really cross the bridge. And we're seeing this right now. It's a real-time problem of how am I going to decide how to treat you if it's only based on how I've been treated or my knowledge of my very limited knowledge of one-to-one interaction and human experience. Before, when, and even with all the problems, obviously, with religion since the advent of man, when you have this higher principle, or when you have this, you know, deity controlling things, you're thinking about do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal, do not kill. And I feel like one thing that's really interesting as just a cultural commentator or a public intellectual now is seeing a secular ethic trying to take place. And I see it just in young people trying to live together, or, you know, figure out things like without marriage, like how does polyamory work? Like things I'm just seeing real time, like around the neighborhood and in New York cultural society, of these questions of how are we going to figure out what it means to be a brother, to be a sister, to be a community member, to be a voter, without these higher principles that are guided by religion. If we throw away our parents' religion, if we throw away Judaism and Islam and Christianity and the dogmatic ideas that have, you know, also justified patriarchy, also justified racism, what do we replace it with? And of course, it's not something I can answer, but it's something that this play is putting at the forefront, because there is a direct question in the latter half where they say, it's not, we should judge. They decide already we're humans and we have to, you know, analyze and assess our common situation because now we're all in this together. But and then somebody, you know, people want to say like, no, like the gods are supposed to judge. And then there's a point it comes back and it's like, no, it's us, like we're in this. And I think that that's something that it's really downplayed because of the conversations that are brought to the forefront about identity. It becomes very easy to forget that this country and this generation that I'm in, you know, the millennial Gen Z sort of break, is the most secular generation in American history. And really to underestimate and not really see how that has proliferated in our common ideas about democracy, about justice, about marriage, about love and romance, and these other things, it will miss something. We'll miss something if we're not seeing that that question is actually being asked to us as well. Probably more than any other question that this play presents is like, what are we going to do without one nation under God? Is a question that Americans are dealing with, but we don't really think about it. You know, we don't really think about it, especially because it's like most people, we feel we're better off without religion, seeing what it's done to our legislation and our politics and the Bible Belt and et cetera, et cetera. So it's something that fascinates me and I'm thinking about all the time, and seeing this play and seeing them ask this question of like, how do we do right by one another? Because we'll have to give up self-interest for a higher principle, but whose principle? And how do we decide? So that's something that I've been thinking on.
Well, it's actually fascinating, Bianca, to hear you say that, because maybe this is a little bit of spilled tea, but you know, Michael Kahn in the early 2010s, when he wanted to do this, he was inspired by the rise of ISIS and ISIL in the Middle East, and the idea of fundamentalist Islam committing revenge killings in the name of God. And what do you do about a problem like this?
Oh, yeah, that is tea.
And you know, I think the piece did change in some ways as it evolved, but I think you're absolutely right that on an archaeological level, that is still very much a kind of animating impulse with all of, when Orestes enters and is talking about the god entering into him and vindicating all of his actions. It is a problem we're encountering in a different way. And it seems like that's, you know, the last century or whatever, but still very much present. And this other question of, as secular 21st century Americans, where does ethics, where does a sense of civic duty, where does morality derive from, if not from on high handed down to us through this?
And it's really a question of honestly liberal circles, because like the southern half of America and a lot of these enclaves that we are, you know, it's the us versus the mentality, they're still very religious, and it's still very much affecting our Supreme Court that we see real time. And these questions of religiosity are coming to the forefront, but it's something that people often, they don't want to grapple with, because it actually is still probably the most sensitive area. You know, everything else is kind of an open discussion. But even, you know, this is Pride weekend, and it's only been, what, 3 or 5 years since this critical decision was passed down to legalize gay marriage. And so these are questions, the question of religiosity and how we live and what we think about, and presenting a secular ethic that is actually beyond self-interest, is something that I feel like for artists and for thinkers is a critical question of the time that people still don't want to grapple with, because it's actually much easier to grapple with a lot of these smaller questions about the past and identity. But communal responsibility has always been tied up with religiosity in this country. Even when you talk about the civil rights movement, like it was an extremely religious movement. So even as somebody who, you know, is involved in these social justice movements and sees things like Black Lives Matter has had to grapple with what it means to have a Black social justice movement without the Christian church at the center. Very much so deciding what justice and account, because that system was so deeply patriarchal. And, you know, there's like this queer Marxist lens to Black Lives Matter that they're like, we don't need that anymore. And so that's something that throughout, when I was looking at this play, thinking about how people decide who has power and what they think about justice and what they think about love, or, you know, infanticide, all of these things are very much present in questions of modern, like secularity versus religiosity.
Andrew, I'm sorry if I interrupted you. You were going to respond to something Bianca was saying, or my much more rote generic question about the future of democracy.
Right. I mean, I guess I kind of disagree. It's not a new question in the last 20 years. This is sort of back to Dostoevsky saying, you know, without God, what kind of morality do we have? Or Nietzsche's God is dead. This is really sort of coming from post-World War II as well. And for the last 100 years, it's been a central question to art and artists and thinkers, and what do we do? And I had a conversation with Michael Kahn a long time ago now about this play, and that was one of the questions I had is like, is this actually a world where there are gods? And he said yes, which was really interesting. And it's important that we have a discussion between Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. We have a discussion between someone who's very religious and looking for religious symbols and someone who is staunchly atheist. And we have in the last chorus scene, and I know Ellen, you and the cast decided that chorus B is a priest at one point in the last. So I think in some ways it's not moving towards, or this play at least is not moving towards an atheistic world. It's a world where gods exist for some people and have real actions for some people, and for some people don't have real actions. And then how do you have that conversation? So, and how do things get moralized with or without religion? You know, it doesn't take religion for someone to have an idea become moralized or to develop a sacred value. And you see that with some of the chorus members as well. And you see that with Clytemnestra. And the key line in this play, and I have it written on the front of my script that I just sort of look at every day, is this is a human problem that demands a human solution. And so when do people with different relationships to divinity and different relationships to God and morality say, okay, with or without God, with or without gods, when is this just a human issue, and when does my religious God not intervene? Because you don't believe in it. Yeah, Ellen.
Also, sorry, are you done?
Yeah, go for it.
I would also say that Aeschylus is dealing with this as a human problem that needs a human solution. I mean, despite the fact that in the third act, you actually have God striding around the stage, Athena is very clear on the fact that this human problem, this Orestes crime, is not something that she can legislate on. She says, I need a human jury because it is a human problem. This is too big a problem for a god to speak to, I think is what the Greek text says. And the Greeks in general, despite the fact that you actually have gods on the stage, the Greeks in general are concerned in play after play with the fact that the gods cannot solve our problems. The gods cannot be invoked to, the Deus ex machina idea is not actually, it's not a formula that actually can be read through the plays. The plays present problems and the gods come in, and sometimes they present solutions that are wrong, that make no sense. There is this sense, the Greek sensibility is not devoted, it's not this matter of sort of the mystique of the divine that we have to all bow and scrape to. They're constantly questioning the gods. Constantly you have characters like Orestes who are rebelling against the gods, who are, infecting them or, driving them to do things they do not want to do. But this whole notion of how do we, the Greek society was a secular society, and our constitution is supposed to create a secular means of government. We are not looking to the gods to solve our problems politically, and we haven't been since the beginning of this, the foundation of the country. And I just think it's all part of this aspect, this strain of the Western culture, is this agonistic relationship with the divine.
Mhm.
Well, and what's so interesting, and maybe this is a hopeful point to conclude on, is that the Greeks introduced two secular humanist institutions, one of which being democracy, the other invented at the same time being theater, and that these two things are intrinsic to the success of one another. A healthy theater where we can encounter human stories, and a healthy democracy where we can do the same. So I want to thank Bianca, you for your brilliant insights and connections, Andrew and Ellen for sharing your time. It's been such a privilege to be part of this conversation. I also want to thank all of the donors and subscribers at Theater for a New Audience for tuning in. We've been talking for over an hour now, so I really want to let everyone go enjoy their Sunday. And I'm Drew Lichtenberg, logging off. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
I